As you can see, we have a rather large scratch here on this leather jacket. What we're doing at the moment is just applying a little bit of paint to the scratch itself. It's just to sort of colour the discoloration that we've got from the scratch where it's scuffed all the surface up and damaged the grain. So what we need to do, obviously, is to replicate this grain. With it being a scratch, because it's destroyed it, in most cases it's impossible. But we have a solution with LRC. With this video, we're going to show you and teach you how to actually do this by using the paint to create a grain and a couple of other tools. We're going to have a needle that's going to be hot, and it's going to be a matter of, you've got to get the colour absolutely perfect. So your colour matching must be absolutely perfect. But we're going to use various tools to do this, to slowly build up the paint on the surface. Bearing in mind this is a semi-aniline lamb napper, so the grain is extremely fine. So we've got to put that grain back in. But what we've got to do is we've got to find the grain pattern on there. So obviously we've just applied some paint. We're now going to heat that up with the hairdryer to get that nice and warm. And then we're going to flatten down with the spatula. And the reason for doing this is we're pushing the little loose particles down and holding them in position. And the paint is going to act as a glue. It's going to form those back into position and hold them. And we've got to flatten it completely so that there's no raised sections whatsoever from the scratch at all. It's imperative that that is done correctly. Try to massage the leather as you're going so that you can get all the grain sort of showing through, lifted up and massaged correctly. Just give it a good scrub around massage, get it all there so that the paint is forming and falling into the grain. What we're going to have to do next is we're going to have to try to get this grain to be visible and to show up. So, there's going to be various things that we've got to do. We're going to blend the colour off, as you can see. So we're using a tiny amount of paint on the sponge, and we're just blending the colour off on the sides of the actual scratch itself. Most scratches, once they're repaired, you can tell that they're there, but with this particular system, you're not going to see them. So with this method now, what we're doing now is we're actually got a needle, and where we've just applied the paint, it's not quite 100% dry yet, but what we're doing is we're putting an impression. We're following the grain and putting an impression in with the needle and rubbing it into the paint so it falls into the actual grain. And then the spatula again is using that to keep everything nice and flat as it was originally, because it's a very smooth grain. And we've got to try to make that paint get into the grain. So we're going to have to sort of force it to get in there by heating up the needle as well and, pushing it in. So just keep the heat going if you can from a distance. And then we're going to now heat up the needle with a lighter. And we're almost going to sort of burn into the paint. But what that's doing is it's forming the paint back into the line of the leather jacket's grain. And this is where and how it's possible to make this scratch 100% invisible. You've got to keep manipulating it. So don't just sort of get a piece of sandpaper, sand it, rub it, put a bit of colour on, because you're going to make it smooth, especially on something like this. But the key to this is heating up the needle and following the exact grain pattern that was there originally on this jacket. And you've got to keep applying paint. Now, you may think, well, it's going to end up looking plastic. No, because the amount of paint that's actually being applied is absolutely microscopic. We're getting some on the sponge and then we're taking some off the sponge so it's not flooded with paint. It's just got the smallest amount of paint on there. And as you can see, we're hardly touching the surface. Going over, just blending the colour off into the rest of the panel on the leather jacket. And then we're going to start using the needle again to heat up and obviously push. As you can see, we're pushing that into the grain and we're following the grain pattern itself to ensure that the paint follows the exact line that the pattern that the jacket has from the grain. We've got to make sure that that follows it completely, and that's how that you're going to make the scratch disappear 100%. It's a very slow, tedious job, but you've got to follow every single little bit of grain pattern all the way down the scratch. Now, as you can see there, we're heating up the needle. It just makes it nice and warm to enable us to sort of push into the grain. And then just keep prodding it, massaging it. And you just got to keep the process going to get that in. It's It is the most effective way that you could possibly ever remove a scratch from an item, whether that is a leather jacket, a handbag, car seat or sofa, or any other type of leather item that you've got. You know, this is the most effective way that you're going to remove the scratch and make it 100% invisible. As you can see there, you know, from the beginning to what it is now, it is a remarkable difference. And we're just following the grain, as you can clearly see. It's just pushing it in to the grain and we're following it. And you've got to make sure, you've got to have a good eye because you've got to understand what's the grain and where it goes. And you've just got to follow the grain and keep pushing the needle into the grain and it will recreate it. And it's going to look absolutely fantastic. Use the spatula again. It's going to help lay any areas flat that maybe could be lifting during this process. And you can see we're just very carefully following the grain look, putting an impression in, and that's just going to leave that impression there and it's going to make that disappear. You can see how much of a difference it's made already, and it's a phenomenal difference. And there you go, you can see the impression going in after we've heated the needle up and just running that along and making sure that you've got to disguise the scratch, obviously. And the only way to do that is to use paints and heat. And this is exactly what we're doing. We're not using any fillers here whatsoever. There is no need to use fillers. We can actually do this without a single drop of filler. We're actually using, the paint is becoming the filler and it's rubbing into the grain. As you can see there, it looks exactly the same as the rest of the leather jacket. It's fantastic, it's beautiful, and it's making that scratch completely disappear. It's just being very careful with the heat process that you've got to do. You don't obviously want to get your needle too hot, and you've got to make sure that you're not burning it, you know, with the needle being too hot. But you've got to keep massaging the leather, rubbing it in every single direction, making sure that it's pushing that paint in and making it look completely as natural as possible. And that's what you've got to achieve, is to make sure it looks completely natural. It is probably one of the most rewarding processes to do on a leather item, is, you know, to make something invisible. And this is one sure way that you're going to make that happen, by just using this particular technique. You can, in some cases, use a grain pad, and when the paint has virtually dried, put the grain pad down, piece of Teflon paper over the top, and then obviously heat up with the heat iron so it starts to put an impression of grain into the leather also. You can do that, which is another way is possible for doing it. You just got to keep manipulating it and massaging, and eventually you'll get it there and it's going to look absolutely fantastic. But it's, I mean, compared to what it was, it looks phenomenal. Buy all the products online, leatherrepaircompany.com.